Montana Territory, 1882. The wind howled low across the flat. Open land as the sun burned down hard on the cracked dirt outside the town of Dry Creek, where a woman in a faded blue dress stood on the porch of the bank, her fingers clenched tight around a contract that might as well have been a noose. Perrie Beauman was 23, proud and out of options. The family ranch, what was left of it, stood 10 miles west, past the cottonwoods along the Powder River. Her late father had died of a fever last winter, and with no man to run the place, the debts he left behind had grown teeth. The bank had refused her any grace, and now they had offered her one way out: marry a man she had never met, a cattle speculator from Helena who had agreed to pay the loan in full in exchange for her hand in marriage. "If you sign," the banker had said, "you walk free. If not, we auction the land Monday." She had signed. Now she waited for the man she was to marry, a stranger named Silas Hart, 42 and wealthy, and according to the banker's wife, a man who likes things quiet and done his way. Perrie had no children, no family left, and no one to stop it. Until the cowboy rode in. He came down the main street with dust on his boots and a tired bay horse under him, his hat low over his brow and his eyes fixed on the bank steps like he already knew who stood there. His name was Quillan Rhodes. He was 27, lean and strong from hard labor, with sunburn on his neck and a scar that cut across one eyebrow like a reminder he had seen worse than bad deals. He stopped his horse just feet from her, swung down, and said in a voice that carried, "You Perrie Beauman?" She blinked, startled. "I am." He looked at her, really looked like he was searching for something in her. "You do not want to marry that man." Her fingers curled tighter around the contract. "It is not about want." Quillan did not ask permission. He walked up the steps, took the paper from her hand, and turned to the banker who had just stepped out with Silas Hart behind him, tall and dressed too fine for Dry Creek. "How much is the loan?" Quillan asked. $500, the banker said, eyes narrowing. "And that contract makes it his debt now." Quillan pulled a worn leather pouch from his saddlebag and dropped it in the banker's hand. Coins clinked together, heavy and final. "Count it. She is paid up." Silas took a step forward, face flushed. "You have no right. She is not for sale," Quillan said, not raising his voice, not looking away from Silas. "Not anymore." Perrie could not breathe. She stood frozen, heart pounding, as the banker counted the money and nodded once, tight-lipped. "She is free of the debt," he said. Quillan turned to her then, and for the first time she saw something break through the hard lines of his face, something quiet and steady. "You are free, Perrie. No man gets to own you." She stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged, but his jaw worked like it hurt to answer. "Because I know what it is to be trapped, and because no woman should be sold like livestock." Silas cursed and stormed off. The banker followed, pocketing the pouch. Perrie stayed on the steps, the dust swirling around her boots, trying to understand what had just happened. "Do you want me to leave?" Quillan asked. She shook her head. "I do not understand you," he nodded. "That is fair." He stepped down, picked up his reins. She watched him walk back to his horse like he had already decided to disappear again, but before he could swing up, she stepped forward. "You paid $500, she said. "That was not nothing. I do not want it back. I do not have it to give." He looked at her again. "I did not ask for anything." She hesitated. "Then let me feed you dinner." He tipped his hat just once. "All right." They rode out together, 10 miles back to the ranch. The land was dry, but the house still stood. 2 horses grazed in the back corral, and a thin line of smoke curled from the chimney where she had left stew on low. Perrie moved through the small kitchen like muscle memory, setting 2 bowls down, slicing bread, pouring water. Quillan sat at her table like he had never expected to be invited anywhere. They ate in silence. When it was done, she leaned back in her chair and asked, "Where are you headed?" "Nowhere. I was passing through. You going to keep riding?" He looked at her, long and careful. "Not if I have a reason to stay." She felt that low in her chest, like a door cracking open. Later, after the sun dipped behind the hills and the wind turned cold, she brought out a blanket and offered him the barn or the porch. He took the barn, said he was used to the company of horses. She watched him go, the way his shoulders moved under his shirt, the way he walked like he had carried too much weight for too long. That night she slept with the windows open and her heart too loud in her chest. In the morning he was still there, leaning against the fence with a mug of coffee and her dog at his feet like he had always been part of the place. "You got any plans for this land?" he asked. She crossed her arms and looked out across the fields. "I want to keep it alive." "I just did not have the means," he nodded once. "You do now." She narrowed her eyes. "You think you can just stay here and fix things?" "No," he said, "but I can work, and I will not leave you to fight this alone." Perrie stared at him a moment longer, then nodded. "All right, then." He stayed. They worked side by side through the hot days and long evenings. He mended the fence line. She cleaned out the chicken coop. They rode into town only when they had to, and when they did, people looked at them different, curious, maybe, or cautious. But no one dared make comments loud enough to be heard. She learned that Quillan had grown up in Kansas, lost his family in a raid, drifted west with nothing but a horse and a rifle. He had never spoken about love, but he looked at her like he knew what it could be. And she found herself waking each morning hoping he would still be there. One night, as the stars came out over the prairie and the fire burned low, Perrie brought out 2 mugs and sat beside him on the porch. "You do not have to stay forever," she said. "I know, but I would like it if you did." He looked over at her, his eyes soft and steady. "I already decided to." She tried to speak, then stopped. Her hand moved slow and nervous until it brushed his. He took it and held on. The first frost came early that year, brushing the dry grass silver and turning the morning still and brittle. Perrie stood at the pump, her breath visible as she filled the tin pail, her shawl pulled close around her shoulders. Somewhere behind the barn, Quillan was splitting wood, the rhythm of the axe steady and sure. The sound had become something she listened for without realizing, an anchor in the quiet. The ranch had started to breathe again. They'd traded 2 hens for seed oats, patched the roof with reclaimed shingles from an abandoned line shack, and cleared the north pasture of windfall and cottonwood. Still, the work outpaced the daylight, and the borrowed mule they'd taken on from the neighboring rancher was starting to limp. Perrie carried the water inside, set the pail down with a thud, and wiped her hands on her apron. Her back ached in a way she'd grown accustomed to, but her mind was restless. She had meant to speak to Quillan days ago, but the right moment kept slipping past. When he stepped in, shoulders dusted with bark, she finally said it. "I've been thinking about selling the east field." He didn't answer right away, just set the axe head gently by the door and unlooped the scarf from his neck. "That land's low," he said at last. "It floods easy. You'd not get much for it, I know. But we need a sound mule and enough canvas to patch the wagon bed before snow." He pulled off his gloves and set them on the table. "You'll get more trading labor than selling land. I can break horses." Did it for 2 years in the Judith Basin. She leaned against the counter, surprised. "You never said. Didn't come up." He paused, then added, "The man I worked for, he took me on when I had nothing but a busted stirrup and a cracked tooth. Taught me to keep my word even when it cost more than you figured." She crossed the room slowly, her hands still damp. "Do you think he'd have liked the man you are now?" He looked at her, then down at his boots. "I think he'd say I learned slow but honest." She nodded once. "That's enough for me." He met her eyes, and something passed between them, unspoken, but solid. That afternoon, they rode to the Weller place, where 3 young broncs stood unused behind a crooked fence. Perrie did the talking, striking a trade for 2 weeks' work in exchange for the gray mule and a length of canvas. When they returned home, the wind had shifted, carrying the scent of snow. They spent that night by the fire, both too tired to speak much. Perrie mended a pair of gloves while Quillan cleaned the rifle, the lamplight soft on his face. She watched the way he moved, careful and methodical, and it settled something in her. The next morning, she took down the ledger her father had kept, the one with ink faded to brown and numbers that no longer mattered. She found a blank page at the back and wrote 2 names, hers and Quillan's. She didn't show it to him. Not yet. But she placed it in the top drawer where he'd find it if he ever went looking. Later, as they repaired the chicken wire along the coop, he asked, "What did you want before all this?" She didn't pretend not to understand. "I wanted to raise Appaloosas. My father said it was foolish to keep horses you couldn't saddle for work. And now, I still want it. I just don't say it out loud as much." He nodded, then stood and brushed off his hands. "Then we'll start with one. You pick and I'll help train it." She stared at him, the wind tugging at the corner of her scarf. "You can't just give me that." "I'm not giving anything," he said. "I'm standing in the life I want." She didn't answer, but her breath caught in her throat like something had shifted inside her, some old grief giving way to something new. That night, she left the door unlatched when she went to bed. When he stepped in, hours later, she didn't speak. She just moved aside, and he lay down next to her, both fully clothed, both quiet. In the dark, his hand found hers. She didn't pull away, and neither of them let go. By late November, the ground had hardened beneath the hooves of the mule, and the creek behind the house had grown a thin skin of ice. Perrie kept a kettle on the stove most mornings now, steam rising soft into the rafters while the light came in slow and white through the east-facing window. She had begun waking before Quillan, just to sit in that quiet with her hands wrapped around the warmth. The barn repairs were nearly done, and they had enough hay stacked to last into the first weeks of February. The work had been hard but steady, and the rhythm of their days had settled into something that felt like breathing. That morning, she found Quillan at the table with a folded piece of paper and a pencil, his brow creased. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed loosely. "You writing someone?" He looked up, not surprised to see her, just thoughtful. "Trying to remember a name. There was a man in Miles City, used to train Appaloosas for the army out at Fort Keogh. He owed me a favor. Might be willing to part with a filly cheap if he's still around." Perrie stepped closer, voice low. "You were serious." He turned the pencil once between his fingers. "You said you wanted it." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "I haven't thought that far ahead in a long time." Quillan didn't speak for a moment, then said, "That's the trouble with surviving, makes you forget you're still allowed to want things." She traced the edge of the table with her thumb. "What do you want?" He looked at her then, steady. "A place that doesn't shift under me. Someone who sees me coming and doesn't flinch." Perrie held his gaze, her voice quiet but sure. "You already have that." Outside, the wind picked up, shaking the last of the cottonwood leaves from their branches. The roof creaked against it, but inside, the silence held. By midday, they rode out to the far west line to check the fence where elk had broken through last week. Quillan rode the mule, reins loose, while Perrie took the younger gelding, its ears twitching at each gust. Snow was coming. She could smell it in the brittle air. At the break, they found 3 posts splintered, wire slack and twisted. Quillan crouched to examine it, his hand brushing over a patch of fur caught on a nail. "Bull elk," he said. "Big one, came through fast." She unslung the coil from her saddle. We can brace it with the extra posts in the draw. He nodded, and they worked without need for talk, boots crunching over frozen ground, breath clouding between them. When the last wire was drawn taut and the final stake driven deep, Perrie straightened, her fingers stiff inside her gloves. Quillan stepped beside her, eyes on the tree line. "You ever think about leaving this place?" She took a slow breath, then let it go. "I thought about it every day after Pa passed, but even when I hated it, I couldn't walk away. My mother's buried out by the ridge." He nodded, quiet. "That kind of thing ties you in ways nothing else does." She looked at him. "What ties you? You still drift like you're waiting for something to pull you back under." He didn't answer right away. Then, "Used to be I didn't stay anywhere long enough for anyone to notice if I left. That gets ugly after a while. You're not like that here." He met her eyes. "No, I'm not." They mounted up and rode back under a sky the color of iron. Snow began to fall just as they reached the yard, light and slow, clinging to the porch rail and the brim of his hat. That evening, Quillan brought in a stack of firewood and set it by the hearth. Perrie stood by the stove, stirring what little dried cornmeal they had left into a pot of beans. When she turned, he was watching her not in passing, but with a kind of stillness that made her set the spoon down. "What is it?" He stepped closer, not touching her. "I want to ask you something, not because I think I've earned it yet, but because I mean to." Perrie's heart picked up. She nodded once, silent. "I want to make a life here, with you, not just for a season or until spring comes. For good." She didn't look away. "You're not just saying that because you paid off my debt, are you?" "No," he said. "I did that because no one should be bought. I'm asking this because I want to be chosen." Perrie reached for his hand, their fingers meeting in the space between them. "Then hear me clear, I choose you, Quillan Rhodes." His hand tightened around hers, and the breath he let out trembled just enough that she felt it in her chest. They didn't kiss, not yet. But they stood there as the fire crackled, and the snow thickened outside, and the space between them closed until there was nothing left to say. The promise was already made. By the time December settled across the Powder River Valley, the wind came in long, low sweeps that rattled the shutters and drove the cattle into the lean-to for shelter. Perrie stood by the window near dawn, her arms wrapped around herself, watching flakes settle on the sill like ash. The world had turned white overnight, and the line of pines in the distance had softened under the weight of it. Behind her, Quillan stirred the embers in the stove until flame licked back up through the coals. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The quiet between them was no longer uncertain, it was thick with knowing. He poured water into the kettle, then rested his hand on the iron top to feel the warmth. "I'll ride into Dry Creek today," he said. "Shouldn't be more than a few hours." Perrie turned from the window. "What for?" "Mail came last week. I asked the postmaster to hold something." He reached for his coat and shrugged into it. "It's time." She studied him. "You didn't say anything." He pulled on his gloves, "Didn't want to until I knew it had come." She stepped closer, her voice low. "You sure it's worth the ride in this cold?" He met her eyes, and there was something quiet in his expression that steadied her. "I wouldn't go if it wasn't." She followed him out to the porch, the snow crunching beneath their boots. He saddled the mule while she tightened the cinch, and neither spoke of what waited in town. As he mounted, she placed her hand on his knee. "Be back before dark." "I will." He touched the brim of his hat and rode off, his figure shrinking into the gray horizon until only the tracks in the snow remained. The day moved slow. Perrie swept the floors, stacked kindling, and stitched up a tear in the saddle blanket, but her thoughts kept circling back to that folded paper he'd written on weeks ago. She hadn't asked then, hadn't wanted to press. But now, curiosity itched behind her ribs. She climbed the loft ladder in the barn to check the rope lashings along the rafters, but her eyes kept straying to the saddle he always used, the way the leather had worn smooth where his leg pressed. When he returned, the sun had dipped low, casting the snow in blue shadow. She opened the door before he reached it, and he stepped inside with a gust of cold and a parcel under one arm. She didn't ask what it was. He set it gently on the table and unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a ledger, thick and bound in worn oilskin, and a folded deed with a notary stamp from Dry Creek. He looked at her. "I put the land in both our names." She stared at the paper. "You didn't have to, I know. But I want to build something that doesn't disappear when one of us does." She reached out, her hand brushing his wrist. "What are you saying, Quillan?" He held her gaze. "I'm saying I want to marry you, not to claim anything, just to make it true." She didn't speak at first. Her chest felt too tight. Then, "There's no one left to ask for permission." He answered without hesitation. "Then we ask each other." She stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat rising from his coat, the scent of pine and saddle soap clinging to him. "You still want to tie yourself to a woman who nearly sold herself off to save a patch of dust?" He touched her jaw, rough fingers gentle. "That woman saved her land without giving up who she was. There's not a thing in this world more worth tying myself to." She leaned into him, her forehead resting against his. "Then yes, I'll marry you." Outside, snow drifted against the window panes. Inside, they stood in the hush of firelight. The knot between them pulled tight, not by debt or desperation, but by the quiet choosing of two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to build. The snow didn't let up for 5 days. It came heavy and clean, muffling the world in a hush that made every bootfall sound impossibly loud. Perrie and Quillan kept to the rhythms of winter, hauling water in buckets from the creek where the ice had to be broken each morning, feeding the mule and gelding from the dwindling haystack, and keeping the fire high against the cold that crept in through the floorboards. Quillan started carving at night, just small things at first. Handles for the kitchen knives, a spoon to replace the one that had cracked at the bowl. Perrie didn't say anything at first, just watched the way his hands worked the blade, sure and patient. One evening, she picked up a piece of scrap pine, sat beside him, and began whittling without asking if she was doing it right. They didn't speak, but the sound of blades against wood, soft and steady, filled the silence like music. On the 7th morning, the sky broke open to blue, and the snow glittered on the fence rails like crystal. Quillan stepped out to check the traps he'd set near the draw rabbit mostly, with a hope for fox, and returned with a half-frozen hare and a grin that reached his eyes. "Care to make stew?" he asked, holding up the limp thing by the legs. "You skin it, I'll cook it." They worked side by side, cleaner now in their movements than they'd been weeks earlier, more attuned to how the other moved and paused and reached. It wasn't that they needed fewer words, it was that they didn't need them to understand. By mid-afternoon, the road to Dry Creek had cleared enough for a wagon, and they took the opportunity to ride in for supplies. The town looked different, quieter under the weight of snow, and the people they passed tipped their hats or nodded but didn't linger. Perrie noticed it the way some of the judgment had faded from their eyes. Or maybe it was that she no longer carried it like a stone in her own chest. They stopped at the mercantile for flour, salt, and lamp oil. Quillan added a small tin of coffee, which she raised an eyebrow at but didn't argue. When they reached the counter, the storekeeper, a man named Elwyn who'd once refused her credit on account of her being unanchored, said nothing about the deed Quillan now carried in his coat. But he did give her the flour without asking for coin up front. On the ride back, she leaned into Quillan's side, her cheek against the rough wool of his coat, and said, "You think they're starting to believe I belong here." He clicked his tongue for the mule to keep pace. "Doesn't matter what they think. You know you do. The wedding happened in January, quiet and without fanfare. They rode north to the homestead of a circuit preacher who kept a small chapel beside his smokehouse. The man married them with his wife as witness, and afterwards served them boiled potatoes and hard biscuits in a room warmed by a pot-bellied stove. Perrie wore her mother's brooch pinned to her collar. Quillan wore the same coat he'd arrived in. They signed the register, nodded their thanks, and rode home through a windless dusk that smelled of pine and wood smoke. That night, they shared the same bed not out of necessity, but because they belonged there. He traced the back of her hand with his thumb, slow and reverent, and when she turned toward him, there was nothing hesitant in the way she pressed her mouth to his. They made love without speaking, the kind of closeness that came not from fire but from something deeper, earned and rooted. Spring brought thaw and mud, and with it, a letter from Miles City. Quillan handed it to her, then stepped outside to give her space. The man he'd written to had answered a bay filly, 6 months old, half Appaloosa, would be delivered in early May. The price was low, the terms generous. Perrie read it twice, then folded the paper and tucked it into the ledger where their names were written side by side. When the filly arrived, she was spindly and wide-eyed, with a pale blanket across her haunches like spilled milk. Perrie named her Clover and spoke to her in the dusk when the barn was quiet and the world felt too large. Quillan watched, but didn't interfere. He knew enough to let her come to it in her own time. They built a small corral behind the barn that summer. It took them 6 days, 2 blisters and 1 argument about the gate hinges, but when it was done, it held solid. Perrie leaned on the top rail, watching Clover nose the hay, and said, "We'll need more feed this winter." Quillan joined her, arms folded. "We'll manage." She looked over at him. "You still content?" He nodded slow. "More than I've ever been." By autumn, they'd traded a month of labor for a Jersey cow, and Perrie was learning to make butter in the early mornings when the house was cool. Quillan had carved a cradle, though neither of them had spoken aloud yet of children. It sat in the corner near the hearth, covered by a quilt her mother had pieced together from old shirts. One evening, as the first frost returned to the ground and the cattle huddled close in the shelter, Perrie stood at the threshold of the barn, watching the stars return. Quillan came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. She reached up to touch his cheek. "You think it'll last?" He kissed the spot below her ear, careful and sure. "It already has." They slept that night with the windows open, the wind cool and clean. Outside, the land held quiet, but inside, everything warmed from the center out. Years passed, and the land did what land does. It gave and took, froze and thawed, grew stubborn things slow and sure. Perrie and Quillan held to it and to each other. They raised Appaloosas and 2 children with the same firm gentleness they'd built their life with. The cradle Quillan carved held both babies, worn smooth at the rails from small hands and long nights. They aged with the land, not against it. And when they sat together on the porch in the evenings, her hand still found his without thought, and his thumb still traced the back of hers like it had that first winter. Nothing had come easy, but everything they had built together, and it was enough. Always.